Awesome. So in this section, as you can see, we're going to be doing some leather. I do already have the PSD set up, and we can start from here. So this leather texture, I kind of am going to be able to get off pretty easy on because it's going to be quite easy to pull the color variation out. You can see, that we've got this pretty nice grain across this. This is going to be a kind of soft leather, but we can look at shining it up a little bit and all of that and just kind of play around with it from there. So first things first, I'm just going to duplicate this and same kind of thing here. We can desaturate it, and you can already see when I really start playing with this that we've got quite a bit of awesome variation in here. So, oh yeah, right in there. That's pretty cool. So I can essentially start out by creating a nice mask for myself. Something to really pull that grain out. And this black and white mask, I can leave a little bit of range in there because I can remap it in Maya. But this is really going to be, I can remap this for glossiness. This can be the base for my specular if I even want to. This is going to get us really far, which is awesome. Next, I do want to go in and try and get, just desaturate this again and use our good old high pass filter to see if we can get, some sort of decent looking bump map out of this. Probably something right in there. I do want to invert that. So perfect. Now you can see those dark cracks in the leather. So that's really it. And we can play around with it from there. And we'll save out these three textures. Cool. So far, so good. So in our save as, I just created these three TIFFs, color, mask, and bump. And we can bounce over to Maya, which we've got a new file. So this one's going to be material types leather. And we can start pulling these in. So we'll get our file textures started. And we'll start sourcing these leathers. So here's our color. And I've got my IPR rolling, so I'm just going to connect that in. There we go. So same process, texture input gamma, and I want to start playing around with this tiling until I'm happy with it. So 3 is looking pretty good. Looks like my tiling may not be perfect, but we can always work that out a little bit later. So we'll just get this duplicated. This is going to be my bump map, so I'm going to turn off texture input gamma. And let's go ahead and connect that up. This is feeling a little soft. We can crank that up if we need to. Cool. And now let's turn on our reflection. So right off the bat, our kind of chromed out leather is not going to be good. Let's get that IOR down to 1.33, and let's really soften up that glossiness a little bit. And we can start getting something a little bit closer to a nice leather. So right now, with this glossiness right around 0.7 or so, I think my bump map's a little too high now, so let's crank that back down a little bit. Something around in there. This is going to be an extremely shiny leather. And a nice trick I like to do for leather is get a little bit of blue in that highlight. I feel like leathers just tend to reflect, ever so subtle blue. That's totally a stylized kind of thing. You can do that or not. It isn't gonna change the look of it. But you can see what I wanted to start out by showing is that immediately with only a bump and a color, this is looking pretty cool. And it's really not that bad, just by 2 really solid textures. So now we can take this a little bit further, of course, and start working it out. So generally the areas of the grain in between where those lines are happening will be a lot less specular. So I'm going to duplicate that bump texture, and I'm going to bring in this leather mask and we'll start working with it. So I'm going to insert a color remap, and I'm going to also refresh the swatch, and I'm going to bring this light forward, and the darks will just leave where they are. And this would be a pretty good, beginning of a spec map. I want to bring this white to blue, and now we can map this in. And we can start seeing what that feels like. Oh, I killed it. And so we can brighten this even more. And we can just keep bringing it up until I get it to a spot that I'm happy with. And I can change my render region here. So I'm really just focusing on this little tiny area. And I can see and I can clamp this down. It might be inverted. Let's do that. That's it. So, going to this reflection render element, I can see that I had that inverted. So it's definitely always a good idea to really keep an eye on these render elements. And now I can kind of work backwards here, and I can ease some of this darkness back out and even pull some of this brightness back forward. So, and again, I'm looking at my swatch, I'm looking at my render, maybe even pull that back a little bit. I like how I'm starting to see some of those lines, and maybe even a little bit further back. And it's just really about, dialing this, nudging it, looking at your render. I should probably be looking at my actual render. And you can see that's pretty cool. It's definitely held out in those areas. Overall, I'm feeling very happy with that. So again, just, 3 textures, I was able to get a pretty nice leather. And, it's something that gets overthought. I think a lot of shaders and textures get overthought, but as long as you're sourcing really nice quality textures, which I know is of course easier said than done, you can get some really high quality materials very quickly. This is a first step to a lot of my scenes is blocking out materials like this and seeing how they look on the objects before I move forward into the full, texturing phase. I like to have a, kind of global idea of what certain materials are going to be, what's metal, what's leather, what's brass, what's dirt, what's glass. All that kind of stuff is a really big part of the look dev process. So this is pretty cool. So I'll just leave this as is. We'll just name it our leather material. And now, just like everything, we can, again, I'm probably at this point, you're probably wondering why I'm saying the same stuff over and over again, but it's really very true. You can work these shaders, and the same process can be applied to everything. So I'm going to start getting in here. I'm going to show a slightly different node. So this is going to be the V-Ray curvature node. So this V-Ray curvature node will find edges, and you can use this. You can see we've got a sample spread, all this kind of stuff. We can play around with this till we get a nice edge, and we can map in a new leather shader onto those edge, into the edge mask that I'm going to generate here. And so again, it's kind of sticking to the procedural workflow for now until we get in and really start painting textures on an actual asset. But let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to create my V-Ray blend. And let's go ahead and save this in case I do anything stupid. And I'm just going to map in my main base leather here. And I'm going to bring in my curvature. And I'm going to build one more V-Ray material. And this is going to go in my coat material. And while I'm testing new stuff like this, I always like to go in and play around with my settings a bit. And so I'm just going to make this green. It's actually pretty obvious already where it's happening, but having it be just a completely opposite color is a really nice way to just see exactly what's going on. So now I can start playing around with some of these curvature values. So the way this node works is we've got our subdivs at the top for quality. It's a ray traced operation, kind of like ambient occlusion. And then we've got our sample spread, minimum and maximum output if you want to clamp the value, so you can lift it up or lower it down. And then you've got a scale at the bottom. I usually like to find a nice spread that works. You can see if I raised this, it would get much more green because the samples are getting spread over the whole object. For this case, you can see that went almost solid green. I'm going to want to lower this quite a bit. So maybe we'll try like 0.25. And what I'll start getting is this really nice green ring. Yep, awesome. Another thing you can do is let's try a slightly bigger spread, you can start trying to lower the scale, and that can start getting some nice results as well. So that's kind of cool. And now let's see what happens if I lower the scale to 0.5. So see, lowering the scale really helped clean up some of this, where I was getting a lot of noise happening right in here across the base. And, you know, again, maybe even if I lower the sample spread a little bit more, I can maybe clean this up even a little bit more. Awesome. Yep, looking cool. And you can see the scale is finding a really nice edge there, nice edge there. And now I can actually still go in and I can, you know, push and pull this around a little bit and see what I get, and potentially even multiply it through some other textures and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and try that first. So I'm sure you've noticed I always like remapping these values into ramps so that I can push and pull them around. That's what I mean by that. And you can actually still do it even with a node like this. So I can just create a ramp. I can delete its placement node because I don't need it. And what I can do is I can say out color red. And by default, this is a VRAMP. So I can connect this in and I can actually map this black and white value that I'm generating into the V coordinate of this texture. So let's map this in. So in theory, this should look exactly the same when I map it in. Yep, pretty much. And so now I actually have this as a remap value. So I can bring these whites way up, and I'm going to clamp this texture and bring all of that information forward. And see, now I'm starting to get really nice edges found. And I can even, you know, I can pull this a little bit more, and then I can even start nudging this black down. And now I'm starting to get these really nice crisp edges. So these don't really have a fall off anymore, which is kind of the idea because this is this leather texture. I don't really want there to be this soft gradation to a new leather color. So what I can do is take this and multiply some sort of grunge texture through it next. So I can get a file texture, and we can load up any of those same old grunge. I've got some leather grunges as well. So see, something like this is pretty cool. I want to try that first. And, you know, I can, because this is a ramp, I'm essentially going to get the effect of multiplying it by simply mapping this file texture into the color gain here. And we can see what that looks like. Cool. So now we're starting to get somewhere. And we're starting to get that edge nice and broken up. Again, I can, you know, insert a color remap here if I want to, and start doing the exact same thing where I'm able to use these ramps to move the texture around. So here's my remap ramp, and it seems I broke it, so I might have to figure out what I did here. Let's just see what happens if I pull this forward. Maybe it'll come back. Yeah, so I think I just clamped it, inadvertently clamped it. So I can move that a little bit. So see, now I'm starting to get some of that texture, and I can pull this black in to start eating away at it, because that's really the goal here. Exactly. So that's looking pretty interesting now. And, you know, you can do some really fascinating things with this workflow. You can really, that's what I'm looking for. something like that. So, you know, it's really starting to actually have a texture now instead of just simply having, you know, a line inside of it. So if this was actually a tileable texture, it might work slightly better. And, you know, again, I can even multiply a tileable texture into this as well. So maybe something like one of those grunge, you know, this thing we've been using a lot. These other ones probably wouldn't work so well. You know, I'm just kind of going through my library and trying to find some cool stuff that I can play around with. So maybe this leather grunge here. And the color management's kind of confusing when you're dealing with some of that stuff, so you can always flip it off and on. So let me move my node editor. So I'm just going to turn that off for right now, and then I'll be able to really see exactly what these linear values are as I'm working with them. So again, same old, going to insert a color remap. I'm going to refresh that swatch so I can see what's going on up here. And now I'm just really going to get that something like that. It's pretty cool. And I can go in and tile this a whole bunch. 10's probably too much. And I could even see what happens if I multiply that in. So I've got a ramp here. There we go. And then I've got my other ramp here. So, you know, I have another color gain slot that I can map in. Oh, I zoomed out my camera on accident. So let's use our bracket button. There we go. Beautiful. So daisy chained a bunch of textures together, and I've created a really awesome mask for myself. I know that may seem like a lot of work because you could just paint it, but this is technically procedural right now. And so if this model changed, if the UVs changed, if they added a whole bunch of new parts to this, whatever this, you know, shader ball is representing, this would automatically update and be working all the same, which is awesome. So this is great, and it's looking pretty cool now. I can even bring in some additional bits of, you know, bring some of this back so I'll get a little bit more of these pieces showing up. It's a little bit sparse right now, so I want to bring a little bit of it back. That's cool. It's looking pretty cool. And nice. So I can change my green shader now into an actual leather shader. And this, I have a texture saved out for you already. It's this one right here, leather 2. And so this is intended to be kind of the interior leather. The color of leather that you see, there's also this leather big, which is a really nice example of an old piece of leather. But we can just tile this and we can get this old leather going in as our diffuse color. And I'm going to need that texture input gamma. And then this will get updated in 1 second. And immediately, those colors should work together really nicely. And yeah, exactly. So now we've got this nice edge detailing across these objects, which is beautiful. And, you know, because I'm only revealing little bits and pieces of that, this shader doesn't need to be crazy complex. Maybe just a little bit of specular glossiness that's really soft, tiny bit of roughness on that guy. I can map the exact same color texture into the bump, so it just gets something in there. And then I'm going to use that same trick that I've used in previous sections here, where I'm going to create a V-Ray bump material. And I'm going to connect this leather into the bump. I'm going to use the exact same mask that I have that I'm holding out the leather. And I'm just going to have ever so subtle amount of negative bump. And then I'm going to switch that into that shading group there. And so I'm going to get a little bit of a lip of detail, and I'll be able to see that that leather is getting eaten away. So notice how, again, it's like I'm not even painting maps for this stuff. I'm able to just work in this semi-procedural way. It's, you know, it's not fully procedural because these are still textures. But building your shaders this way can save you tons of time, and you can also, on top of it, you can, you know, you can take what I'm supplying you in this instructional video, and you can build on it. You can make your own. You can create yourself a little mini shader library to do all sorts of cool stuff. So let's see what this is looking like in some of the other light setups. So save our file. Let's bounce back over to, you know, these are so different, the sun and sky versus the studio setup, that it's always good to see. So we'll start there. Feeling a little too bumpy now that this is kind of cleaned up a little bit. So I want to go back down to that source leather material. And I overcranked it. That studio setup is so soft, it's just really difficult to tell these bumps. You think I would have learned by now with all of the same issue happening where I'm dialing my bump values in that soft lighting environment, and then I come up to this main sun and sky, and I end up turning it down every time. So, but I never learn, and I always keep thinking that it's going to look good. So that's pretty cool now. That's a little bit nicer. You can see when it was overcranked at that 1.25 value, the specular is really getting pulled across the surface too much. You know, you can see that specular just really kind of carrying down across the object, and we're not, you know, it just doesn't feel right. It definitely feels overcranked and kind of weird. So right when I set that down, I think I had it at 0.5, it really limited where that specular was happening. And that's what I'm looking for here. Something a little bit more like that. So let's do one full res render. There we go. Yep, totally solid. Looks really, really nice. Got that little bit of edge damage happening. The specular is feeling really good. So now we can go down and we'll just do quick render in Studio Light Setup B. Still feeling really great. So we're going to call this one done. Might want to crank the bump a little higher. You know, it's always tricky when you've got two very different light setups like that. But you know, I might be able to find a nice even point. It's feeling a little too smooth to me right now, but if you look at the reflection pass, you can definitely still feel some of that bump in there. But overall, it's feeling really great. So that wraps it up for the section about, you know, creating these different types of materials. And I just want to let you know that there's actually other textures that I got that I didn't end up using in this section. You can see there's rubber, tarp, wax, and then if you go inside metal, there's a painted metal. There's a bunch of stuff in here that's going to be coming with the video. And I really encourage you to just play around with all of it. You can go online, you can find all sorts of other textures, and just really try and make a whole bunch of shaders for yourself. So moving forward, we're going to be jumping back into our bird asset and taking it to the next level.